"Stay on the path," the palace guard beside Esther grunted, his grip on her arm bruising and impatient. The forest around them stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of ancient roots and shadows. "And if you see a beast, don't scream. The AlphaKing doesn't tolerate weakness in his woods." "Oh, and don't try to run," the guard added, checking the tree line with paranoia. "They like to chase." Esther's breath hitched in her throat. "Is there anything in this kingdom that doesn't want to kill us?" "Whatever you do, keep your head down," the guard replied, ignoring her question. Esther's quiet question died in the cold air. The towering trees seemed to press inward, suffocating the light. Yet somehow the trek wasn't fast enough. She focused on putting one worn shoe in front of the other, the thin soles slipping against the damp moss. The forest was hauntingly beautiful, all silver mist and golden autumn leaves, but it felt like a silent grave. Too soon they stopped at a small clearing. Two other guards were already there, standing over a massive, unmoving shape. "The girl is here for the palace service," her escort announced, shoving her forward. The other guards exchanged a look, then gestured to the ground. "She's scrawny for a palace maid," one sneered, looking at her undernourished frame. The other nodded, nudging the massive, bleeding wolf at his feet with a boot. "Just like this mutt, wasting our time, leave it to rot." Heat flooded Esther's cheeks. She opened her mouth to protest their cruelty. She wasn't here to judge the dying, but the words died in her throat. Wasn't she just like this creature? Her stepmother's hateful farewell echoed in her memory. "The king needs servants, not useless mouths to feed. Don't come back." The way she'd said it, the cold calculation in her eyes, Esther understood now. Her family hadn't sent her to the palace for an opportunity. They had sent her through these dangerous woods, hoping she wouldn't make it at all. Esther's stomach turned. Gods, she was just debris to them, wasn't she? It wasn't enough that she'd served her step-siblings for years, starving while they feasted. Now they'd cast her out to be swallowed by the forest or broken by a tyrant king. "No," Esther lifted her chin, her soft oval face hardening with a quiet resilience. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of letting a life fade away just because it was inconvenient. "It's still breathing," she said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "If you won't help him, I will." Before the guards could stop her, she dropped to her knees in the dirt. The massive wolf's eyes snapped open, flashing silver, and locked onto hers with terrible intensity. 3 days. That was the whisper running through the servants' quarters like a fever. No one lasted 3 days with the AlphaKing. Most fled in tears before the first sunset, terrified by the snarling beast who ruled from the shadows of his chambers. But Esther was still there. She moved through the king's private quarters with the soft, unassuming grace that had become her armor over years of invisibility. The room was dim, heavy with the scent of pine and something sharper, wilder. King Martin sat in his wheelchair by the window, his silhouette rigid against the gray afternoon light. He hadn't spoken to her in hours, yet she felt his gaze burning into her back, tracking her every movement as she polished the heavy mahogany desk. He was waiting for a mistake. A dropped vase, a trembling hand, a whimper of fear. He was waiting for an excuse to banish her. "Stop," his voice cut through the silence, deep and rough like grinding stones. Esther froze, lowering the dust cloth. She didn't flinch, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned slowly to face him, keeping her eyes lowered respectfully but her chin level. "Your Majesty." Martin wheeled himself around, the mechanism hissing softly on the stone floor. His face was a landscape of fury and exhaustion, the scar running down his cheek looking particularly stark in the gloom. "You breathe too loud," he growled, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "It's distracting. Get out." It was a test. Esther knew it in her bones. He wanted her to run, to prove that she was just as weak and flighty as the others. But running meant returning to the woods, or worse, to a family that wished her dead. Running meant confirming that she was worthless. "I cannot stop breathing, Your Majesty," Esther said, her voice soft but steady. but I can try to be shallower about it if it pleases you. However, the dust in here is thick. If I leave now, it will only settle again and you will sneeze. Sneezing is surely more distracting than breathing." Martin stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. For a second his eyes flashed that eerie, molten silver, the wolf rising to challenge her. Then, inexplicably, the tension in his massive shoulders dropped a fraction. He scoffed, a harsh sound that might have been a laugh in another life. "You have a sharp tongue for a servant," he muttered, turning back to the window. "Finish the shelves, then leave me." Esther exhaled slowly and returned to work. She knew why he was this way. The palace gossiped. They whispered of the betrayal of the friend who had poisoned him, leaving the strongest warrior in the kingdom bound to a chair. His cruelty wasn't malice, it was a shield. "Why are you here?" he asked suddenly, his voice lower this time, lacking the bite but retaining the suspicion. Esther paused, a leather-bound book in her hand. "To clean, your majesty." "Don't play coy," he snapped, wheeling toward her again with alarming speed. He stopped inches from her, forcing her to look up into his storm-gray eyes. "You aren't a common maid. I saw the roster. You're Esther, daughter of Duke Hemlock. Why is a duke's daughter scrubbing my floors? Is this some spy game? Did your father send you to find my weak spots?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Esther looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the pain etched around his eyes, the defensive hunch of his shoulders. He expected treachery because that was all he had known. "My father," Esther said quietly, the truth tasting like ash on her tongue, "does not know I am here, nor would he care." Martin's brow furrowed, his grip on the chair loosening slightly. "Explain." "My stepmother runs the household," Esther continued, her hands clasping together in front of her plain apron to hide their trembling. "To her I am an expense, an inconvenience. When the call came for palace staff, she didn't send me to gain favor or spy on you, your majesty." She took a steadying breath, her expressive eyes reflecting a deep, old hurt that mirrored his own. "She sent me because she hoped I would fail. She sent me here because she hoped the monster king would dispose of me so she wouldn't have to." Martin went very still. He searched her face, looking for the lie, for the deception. But Esther had nothing to hide. She stood before him, slender and undernourished, wearing a dress that had seen better years, yet possessing a quiet dignity that filled the room. "They threw you away," Martin stated, his voice devoid of its usual growl. "Yes," Esther whispered. "So you see, your majesty, I cannot run. I have nowhere to run to." The king looked down at his own useless legs, then back at the girl who refused to break. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared scars. "Fine," Martin grunted, backing his chair away to give her space. "You can finish the shelves, but do it quietly." As Esther turned back to the books, she saw it, just for a fleeting second. The king watched her not with the eyes of a predator tracking prey, but with the weary curiosity of a man who had finally found something he couldn't frighten away. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy velvet drapes of the king's antechamber, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Esther moved quietly, arranging a tray of tea and dry toast, the only breakfast King Martin would tolerate. The silence of the palace usually felt heavy, oppressive, but today it was broken by the soft click of heels approaching down the corridor. Esther turned just as the double doors eased open. A woman stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of fresh lilies and expensive perfume. It was Princess Kendra. If Martin was the storm, Kendra was the calm after it. She was breathtaking, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes that held none of the jagged fury of her twin brothers. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that whispered against the stone, looking like a fairy-tale princess who had wandered into the wrong story. "So," Kendra said, her voice a melodic chime compared to the king's gravelly growl, "you're the one who survived 3 days." Esther dipped into a low curtsy, balancing the tray with practiced ease. "My lady, I am merely doing my job." Kendra smiled, stepping closer. Up close, her beauty was even more disarming. She looked soft, fragile even, with a warmth that made Esther's shoulders relax for the first time since entering the palace. "You're doing more than a job, Esther," Kendra said, reaching out to adjust a teaspoon on the tray. "You're performing a miracle." The last maid left sobbing because he threw a paperweight at the wall near her head. "My brother, he is not an easy man to be near." "He is in pain, Your Highness," Esther replied softly. "Pain makes wolves of us all." Kendra's smile faltered, replaced by a look of profound sadness. She sighed, a delicate, tragic sound. "You have a kind heart. It's a dangerous thing to bring into this room." She walked past Esther toward the closed door of the king's bedroom, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "He wasn't always this way, you know, before the chair, before Sheamus." The name hung in the air, heavy and dark. Esther had heard whispers in the scullery, fragments of gossip, but no one dared speak the full truth. "Sheamus was his beta," Kendra continued, her eyes drifting to the intricate tapestry on the wall, though she seemed to be looking through it into the past. "They were inseparable, brothers in everything but blood. Martin trusted him with his life, with his secrets, with his heart." She turned back to Esther, her expression hardening with a mixture of grief and warning. "And it was Sheamus who poured the poison." He smiled as he handed Martin the cup. Esther felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty castle. "Why?" "Power," Kendra whispered. "Jealousy, or perhaps simply because it is the nature of things to break." She took a step closer to Esther, her blue eyes piercing. "The poison didn't kill him, obviously, but it took his legs, and it took his mind. He sees Sheamus in everyone now. He sees the knife in every hand, the poison in every cup." She gestured to the breakfast tray Esther was holding. "You think you can heal him with patience and quiet dusting. You think if you are good enough he will stop hating you." Kendra shook her head slowly, a pitying look on her face. "Sheamus was the best of us. He was loyal for 20 years before he wasn't. If Martin's own soul-bonded brother could betray him, what chance does a stranger have?" Esther tightened her grip on the silver handles of the tray. The princess's words were wrapped in velvet, but they struck with the force of a hammer. They painted a picture of a future that was already doomed, a world where trust was a fairy tale and betrayal was an inevitability. "He will hurt you, Esther," Kendra said, reaching out to gently pat Esther's arm. Her touch was cool, light. "Not because he wants to, but because he believes everyone betrays him eventually. He will push you until you break, just to prove he was right to doubt you." "I am stronger than I look, Your Highness," Esther said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had held 3 days ago. "I'm sure you are," Kendra replied, her smile returning, sweet and perfect and empty. "But everyone breaks in the end. Do be careful, my dear. The woods are safer than this room." With a final, sympathetic nod, the princess turned and glided out of the room, leaving the scent of lilies and the lingering cold of her warning. Esther stood alone in the shadows, staring at the closed door of the king's chambers. For the first time, the tray in her hands felt impossibly heavy. The royal library became their sanctuary as the autumn days shortened into early winter. It was a cavernous room, smelling of old parchment, beeswax, and wood smoke, walled by towering shelves that seemed to hold the weight of the kingdom's history. For Esther, who had grown up in a house where knowledge was hoarded like gold and kept just as far from her reach, it was a cathedral. She was meant to be dusting the lower shelves, but her hand had stilled on the spine of a heavy, leather-bound tome. The gold lettering glinted in the firelight, beautiful and indecipherable. She traced the embossed shapes, imagining what secrets they held, strategies of war, ancient poems, or perhaps maps to places where girls like her weren't invisible. "You've been staring at that spine for 10 minutes. King Martin's voice rumbled from the center of the room. Esther jumped, nearly dropping the book. She hadn't heard his wheelchair approach. He moved with a terrifying silence when he chose to, a predator stalking on rubber wheels. He was watching her, his chin resting on a fist, his gray eyes unreadable. "I apologize, Your Majesty," she murmured, hastily sliding the book back into its slot. "I was just admiring the craftsmanship." "You were trying to read the title," Martin corrected, rolling closer. The firelight danced across the sharp planes of his face, softening the scar that marred his cheek. "What did it say?" Esther felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck. Her stepmother had often laughed at her attempts to learn, calling it a waste of candles to teach a servant to read. I do not know, Your Majesty." Martin's brow furrowed. "Your father is a duke, surely the Tudors." "The Tudors were for my step-siblings," Esther interrupted quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I was needed in the kitchens. Books were considered above my station." She expected mockery. She braced for the cruel laugh she had heard from guards and nobles alike. Instead, silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. "Bring it here," Martin commanded. Esther hesitated, then pulled the heavy book from the shelf and carried it to him. He didn't take it from her. Instead, he tapped the armrest of his chair, signaling her to open it on his lap. "It is a history of the Northern Wars," Martin said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that vibrated in Esther's chest. He pointed a scarred finger at the first bold letter. "This is T, the era of frost." He looked up at her, an unspoken challenge in his eyes. "You are not unintelligent, Esther. I see the way you organize my desk. I see how you memorize the patterns of the guard rotations. Ignorance is a cage others built for you. I will not have it in my house." That night marked a shift. The evenings, once filled with the tense silence of a maid avoiding a tyrant, transformed. Martin began to teach her. It started with letters, then words, then sentences. He was an impatient teacher, demanding and intense, but he never mocked her. And Esther, starving for this all her life, learned with a voracious speed that seemed to startle him. One evening, deep into the winter, they were studying a map of the kingdom. Martin leaned forward to trace a supply route, his sleeve riding up. Esther's breath hitched. His forearm was corded with thick muscle, marked by silver scars from battles fought long before the wheelchair. Even seated, there was a lethal grace to him, a contained power that terrified her less and drew her in more. He wasn't a broken thing. He was a coiled spring, dangerous and beautiful. "You see this pass?" Martin asked, glancing up. He caught her staring at his arm, but he didn't pull away. His gaze locked with hers, the gray darkening to the color of a storm cloud. "Yes," Esther breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The Viper's Pass." "It's treacherous," Martin murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper. He didn't look back at the map. "One wrong step and you fall." The air in the library grew thick, charged with something that wasn't about geography or history. Esther stood close enough to smell the soap on his skin and the underlying scent of pine and wolf. For the first time, she didn't see the king, or the invalid, or the employer. She saw a man who had been lonely for a very long time, recognizing the same loneliness in her. She should step back. Protocol demanded it, survival demanded it, but she didn't move. "I am not afraid of falling," Esther whispered, the truth slipping out before she could catch it. Martin's eyes searched hers, the silver flashing briefly in their depths, raw and wanting. For a moment she thought he might reach out, might bridge the final inch between them. But then the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, shattering the spell. Martin cleared his throat, the sound rough, and wheeled himself back abruptly. "That is enough for tonight," he said, turning his face away into the shadows. "Go to bed, Esther." But as she left the library, clutching her lesson book to her chest, Esther knew nothing would be the same. The walls he had built were crumbling, and God help her, she was falling in love with the king behind them. The realization didn't hit King Martin like a lightning bolt. It hit him like an executioner's axe. It happened on a Tuesday, ordinary and gray. Esther was leaning over him to pour wine into the goblet on his desk. The scent of her, rainwater, old paper, and the subtle, sweet warmth of her skin filled his senses, overwhelming the musty smell of the room. As she pulled back, her wrist brushed against his shoulder. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure, raw energy surged through Martin, tearing a gasp from his throat. His vision blurred, the gray world sharpening into terrifying clarity. The wolf inside him, usually a prowling, wounded beast, suddenly lunged against his ribs, howling a single ancient command. Mine, mate. Martin's head snapped up. His eyes flashed, the gray entirely swallowed by molten silver. He locked gazes with Esther, seeing her not just as the quiet maid who organized his books, but as the other half of his soul. The one thing in the universe designed to complete him. Esther froze, the pitcher trembling in her hand. She stared into his glowing eyes, her breath catching. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice laced with a confusion that sounded dangerously like affection. Are you in pain?" The concern in her voice should have been a balm. Instead, it was a trigger. The memory of Seamus crashed over him. Seamus smiling, Seamus pouring the wine, Seamus, whom he loved like a brother, watching him convulse on the floor. Love was not safety. Love was a blindfold. And a mate bond, that was the ultimate vulnerability. If she was his mate, she could destroy him in ways a blade never could. "Get out," Martin rasped, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair so hard the wood groaned. Esther flinched, the softness in her eyes shattering into hurt. "Did I spill?" "I said get out," Martin roared, the silver in his eyes burning with panic. "Leave me." Esther scrambled back, setting the pitcher down with a clatter and fleeing the room without another word. As the door clicked shut, Martin collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Mate. She is my mate. He should be rejoicing. He should be chasing her down the corridor. But the wolf's joy was drowned out by the man's terror. A duke's daughter, abused and discarded, showing up at his door with perfect humility and a healing touch. It was too clean. Too perfect. "You look like you've seen a ghost, brother." Martin didn't look up as Princess Kendra entered. She moved soundlessly, a wraith in pale silk. She didn't ask permission. She simply flowed into the room and poured herself a glass of the wine Esther had left. "Is it the girl?" Kendra asked, her voice light, teasing. "I saw her running down the hall. She looked ready to weep." Martin choked on the word. He couldn't say it. If Kendra knew Esther was his mate, she would congratulate him, tell him to be happy. But he couldn't trust happiness. Kendra circled his desk, her fingers trailing over the papers. "She's getting close to you, isn't she? The reading lessons, the quiet conversations, it's quite a performance." Martin's head snapped up, the silver fading back to a stormy gray. Performance. Kendra sipped her wine, her blue eyes innocent over the rim of the glass. "Oh, Martin, don't be naive. A noblewoman who happily scrubs floors, a girl who claims to be hated by her family yet carries herself with such poise. It's a classic strategy, the damsel in distress. It makes a man want to save her." She set the glass down, her expression shifting to one of sisterly concern. "Think about it. Who better to finish the job Seamus started than someone you invite into your bed? Someone you lower your guard for? If I were your enemy, I wouldn't send an assassin with a knife. I'd send a sweet girl with big, sad eyes." The poison of her words seeped into the cracks of Martin's mind. The perfect trap. If Esther was a spy, knowing he was her mate would be her greatest weapon. She could use the bond to manipulate him, to enslave him. "She isn't like that," Martin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't she?" Kendra leaned in, her voice a soft hiss. "Seamus wasn't like that either, until he was." Martin closed his eyes, the image of Esther's terrified face warring with the memory of Seamus's betrayal. The wolf whimpered, longing for its mate, but the king strangled the instinct with cold, iron fear. He couldn't survive another betrayal. He had to be sure. He had to know if the bond was real, or if she was just playing a part in a play written to end with his death. Esther was polishing the silver candelabras in the East Wing parlor when the heavy oak doors swung open. She expected a guard, or perhaps the sour-faced steward. She did not expect a man who looked so much like the king that her heart stopped in her chest, except this man was standing. He strode into the room with a fluid, predatory grace, his boots clicking sharply against the marble. He was tall, powerfully built, with the same dark hair and arresting gray eyes as Martin. But where Martin was a storm of contained fury and stillness, this man was a restless wind. He wore a velvet coat unbuttoned at the collar, and his smile was a slash of arrogant charm that Martin would never wear. "So," the stranger drawled, his voice a smooth baritone that lacked the king's gravelly depth, "you're the little mouse keeping my cousin company." Esther gripped the polishing cloth, dipping into a curtsy. "My lord." "Lord Brennan," he introduced himself, closing the distance between them with unnerving speed. He didn't stop at a respectful distance. He invaded her space, circling her like a wolf inspecting a trapped rabbit. "I'm Martin's cousin. Though looking at you, I wonder why he keeps you hidden away. You're far too pretty for a cripple's chamber." Esther stiffened. "His Majesty is the king, my lord. I serve him with pride." Brennan laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. He reached out, his fingers grazing a lock of hair that had escaped her cap. Esther flinched, stepping back, but she was backed against the table. "Pride," Brennan scoffed, leaning in. His scent hit her, spiced wine and musk, strangely familiar yet overlaid with something sharp. "Come now, sweet thing. We both know he's half a man. Broken, bitter. He can't give a woman what she needs. He can't take you dancing. He can't chase you through the woods." He trapped her against the table, placing his hands on either side of her hips. On the other hand, I am whole. I am the alpha blood without the defect. Why waste your youth changing bedpans for a monster when you could be warming the bed of a lord?" Disgust coiled in Esther's stomach, hot and violent. It wasn't just the proximity. It was the insult to the man she had come to know in the quiet of the library. The man who taught her to read, whose eyes held a galaxy of pain he refused to inflict on others. "Do not speak of him that way," Esther said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Why not?" Brennan sneered, his face inches from hers. "He's a ruin, a cautionary tale. Leave him to rot, girl. Come with me, and I'll show you what a real wolf feels like." He leaned in to kiss her. Esther didn't think, she reacted. With a cry of fury, she shoved him hard against the chest. "Get off me." Brennan stumbled back, looking genuinely surprised. Esther stood trembling, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective light. "You are not half the man he is," she spat, the words pouring out of her. "King Martin is a warrior. He bears his pain with more strength than you could ever summon in your entire selfish life. His chair does not make him less of a king. Your cruelty makes you less of a man. I would rather scrub his floors until my hands bleed than let you touch me." She was breathing hard, tears stinging her eyes. She expected Brennan to strike her. She expected rage. Instead, the man's expression shifted. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a look of stunned, devastating vulnerability. His posture changed, the loose, predatory slouch snapping into the rigid, controlled tension she knew so well. "Esther," he said. The voice was deep, rough. It was the voice that had read to her in the library. Esther froze. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. She stared at the man standing before her, standing on two strong legs. The glint in his eyes was no longer flirtatious. It was the stormy gray of the AlphaKing. "Martin," she whispered, the name a broken question. Martin took a step toward her, reaching out a hand. "I had to know. I had to be sure you weren't." "You," Esther breathed, backing away as if he had burned her. "You can walk." "I healed weeks ago," Martin admitted, his voice pleading now. "I kept it secret to find my enemies. But Kendra, she said you were a spy. She said you were seducing me to finish what Sheema started. I needed to know if you were loyal to the king or just the crown." The realization crashed over Esther, suffocating her. It wasn't a cousin. It was him. He had put on a costume, mocked his own suffering, and assaulted her honor just to see if she would betray him. You tested me, she said, her voice hollow. I had to, Martin insisted, though he looked sick with regret. Esther, you defended me, you passed. Passed? Esther let out a sob that tore at her throat. This wasn't a test, Martin. It was a trap. I gave you my heart in that library, and you trampled it to satisfy your fear. She looked at him, whole, strong, and utterly terrifying in his deception. The trust they had built brick by brick lay in ruins between them. You are the AlphaKing, Esther whispered, turning toward the door, her vision blurred by tears. But you are also a coward. The small room that had been Esther's sanctuary now felt like a prison cell. Her hands trembled as she folded her few belongings, a spare apron, a worn shawl, and the book of poetry Martin had given her just days ago. She hesitated over the book, her thumb tracing the gold leaf on the cover. It was a promise of a future where she was valued, intelligent, and seen. A promise that had been a lie. She placed the book on the narrow bed. She would not take it. She would take nothing from the man who had looked her in the eye and played a game with her heart. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Esther stiffened, her heart leaping into her throat. Part of her foolish, traitorous soul hoped it was Martin, come to beg on his knees, come to explain that the man in the library was the truth and the man in the parlor was the aberration. But when the door opened, it was Princess Kendra. The princess slipped inside and closed the door quickly, leaning against it as if holding back a flood. She looked distraught, her pale blue eyes wide with sympathy. "Oh, Esther," she breathed, rushing forward to take Esther's cold hands in hers. "I heard shouting. I saw him running down the hall. He was furious." "He was testing me," Esther said, pulling her hands away. Her voice was brittle like dry leaves. "He dressed as another man to see if I was a whore or a traitor. He doesn't trust me, Your Highness. He never will." Kendra sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "I warned you, didn't I? The poison runs deep in his veins. He breaks everything he touches because he is terrified it will break him first." She looked at the meager pile of clothes on the bed. "You are leaving." "I must," Esther said, tying the strings of her satchel with decisive, jerky movements. "I cannot serve a master who thinks me an assassin. I will return to the woods. I will take my chances with the wolves there. At least they do not wear masks." "You can't," Kendra whispered urgently, grabbing Esther's arm. "The castle is on lockdown. Martin has doubled the guard at the gates. He is convinced you are going to run to his enemies with his secrets. If you try to leave now, the guards will drag you back to the dungeon." Esther felt the blood drain from her face. "He would imprison me." "He is not himself, Esther. He is manic. He thinks he has caught you in a betrayal." Kendra bit her lip, looking over her shoulder at the door, then back to Esther. Her expression shifted, hardening with a resolve that looked almost like desperation. "But I cannot let him destroy you. You are innocent. I can see that now." She reached into the deep pocket of her silk gown and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a clear, viscous liquid. "What is this?" Esther asked, recoiling slightly. "It is a sleeping draught," Kendra explained, pressing the cold glass into Esther's palm. "Potent but harmless. Take it to him. Tell him you want to make amends, that you brought him tea to soothe his temper. Once he drinks it, he will sleep for 12 hours. He will be out cold. I will order the side gate open for you myself. By the time he wakes, you will be miles away." Esther stared at the vial. It seemed to catch the candlelight, shimmering with a strange weight. It was a way out. A simple, clean escape from the suffocating grip of the palace. "Just a sleeping draught?" Esther asked, her eyes lifting to Kendra's face. "Just sleep," Kendra promised. She smiled, and for a fleeting second the light caught her eyes in a way that didn't match the warmth of her lips. It was a cold flash, calculation, anticipation. It was the look of a chess player moving a pawn into the path of a queen. A warning bell rang deep in Esther's mind, the instinct of a girl who had survived a cruel stepmother by reading silences and hidden glances. Everyone betrays him eventually, Kendra had said. And now, The loyal sister was handing the maid a weapon to use against the king. "Thank you, your highness," Esther said softly, closing her fingers around the vial. "You are very kind to help a servant." "Go now," Kendra urged, her hand lingering on the door handle, before his mood darkens further. Esther waited until the princess's footsteps faded down the corridor. She looked down at the vial in her hand. It felt heavy, wrong. She thought of Martin's terrified eyes when he revealed his legs, the raw panic of a man who had lost everything once and was trying to protect himself the only way he knew how. She was leaving him, yes. She was furious, yes, but she would not drug him. She would not force him into vulnerability. Esther shoved the vial deep into her pocket, grabbed her bag, and opened the door. She would find another way out. She would climb the walls if she had to, but she would not be the one to hand him the poisoned cup. Esther hurried down the shadowed corridor of the servants' wing, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a shout. Every flickering torch shadow looked like a guard reaching out to grab her. She needed to reach the side gate before the lockdown was fully enforced. She needed to be gone before her resolve shattered. She rounded the corner toward the scullery exit and skidded to a halt. Her path was blocked, not by locked doors but by a wall of royal guards, their halberds crossed. And sitting before them, his face a mask of stony devastation, was King Martin. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dead. Esther took a step back, her hand instinctively going to the pocket where the vial lay heavy and cold. "I cannot stay where I am not trusted, your majesty." "Trusted?" Martin let out a harsh, broken laugh. "I showed you my true self. I revealed my healing legs to you, a secret I have kept from my own counsel, and your response is to run into the night." "You revealed your legs to trap me," Esther countered, her anger flaring over her fear. "You played a game with my honor." "Brother, be careful." Princess Kendra emerged from the shadows behind the guards, her face pale and drawn with theatrical terror. She rushed to Martin's side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "I told you she would try to run, and I told you why." Kendra pointed a trembling finger at Esther. "She has it on her. I saw her hiding it earlier. Search her." Two guards stepped forward, seizing Esther's arms before she could protest. One patted her apron, his rough hands finding the bulge in her pocket immediately. He pulled out the glass vial, the clear liquid shimmering innocently in the torchlight. "What is this?" Martin demanded, staring at the vial. "It's poison," Kendra shrieked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "She's been meeting with the enemies of the crown. She planned to slip it into your wine tonight to finish what Sheamus started." Esther stared at the princess, the breath punched out of her lungs. The betrayal was so absolute, so perfectly orchestrated, that for a moment she couldn't speak. She looked from the vial to Martin's face. The king went white, the color draining from his scars. He looked at the small glass bottle as if it were a viper, then up at Esther with a look of pure, agonizing heartbreak. "Is this true?" Martin whispered. "You would kill me." "No," Esther screamed, struggling against the guard's grip. "She gave it to me. Kendra gave it to me 10 minutes ago. She said it was a sleeping draft to help me slip past the guards." Martin's head snapped toward his sister. Kendra gasped, clutching her chest. "How dare you? I gave you poison to kill my own twin, my own soul." Tears welled perfectly in her blue eyes. "Martin, look at her. She's desperate. She's caught and she'll say anything to save herself, just like Sheamus did." The name was a physical blow. Martin flinched, his gaze wavering. He looked at Esther, the woman who had healed him, the woman his wolf claimed, and then at Kendra, the sister who had stood by his chair for 6 agonizing years. "Martin, please," Esther begged, her voice cracking. "Look at me. Really look at me. Have I ever lied to you? She wants the throne. She told me everyone betrays you eventually. She was planting the seed." "She is lying." Kendra's voice pitched higher, losing its melodic control. She saw the doubt flickering in Martin's gray eyes. She saw him look at the vial not with fear but with calculation. He was thinking. He was analyzing. Kendra couldn't let him think. "I won't let you hurt him," Kendra screamed. The mask of elegance shattered completely. With a speed that shocked the guards into inaction, Kendra snatched a dagger from the belt of the soldier nearest to her. Her face twisted into a snarl of pure, ugly ambition, the innocent sister, vanishing to reveal the rot underneath. "Die, you witch!" Kendra lunged. She didn't aim for the guards holding Esther. She aimed straight for Esther's heart, the blade glinting wickedly in the torchlight. Esther gasped, unable to move, her arms pinned by the soldiers who were too slow to react to the princess's sudden madness. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the cold bite of steel. The blow never landed. Just as the steel bit into the air inches from Esther's chest, a roar shattered the corridor, a sound so primal it vibrated in the stone floor. There was a blur of movement, too fast for human eyes to track, exploding from the wheelchair. A hand, large and scarred, shot out and clamped around Kendra's wrist with the force of a bear trap. The momentum of the interception sent a shockwave through the room. Kendra gasped, her grip on the dagger failing as bones crunched under the pressure. The weapon clattered uselessly to the floor, but it wasn't the sound of the knife falling that sucked the air out of the corridor. It was the sight of King Martin. He was standing. He stood tall and terrible, towering over his sister, his legs planting firmly on the ground with the strength of oak roots. The wheelchair sat empty behind him, its wheels spinning lazily from the force of his launch. The guards holding Esther released her, stumbling back in superstitious terror. Esther slumped against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs, staring wide-eyed at the miracle before her. The broken king, the cripple in the chair, was gone. In his place was the Alpha, radiating a lethal, terrifying power. "You," Kendra choked out, her face draining of all blood. She stared at his legs, her eyes wide with incomprehension. "You can walk." "I have walked for months," Martin growled, his voice a low rumble that promised violence. He didn't let go of her wrist. Instead, he twisted it behind her back, pinning her against the wall with effortless strength. "I stayed in that chair to see who would hand me the next poisoned cup. I never thought it would be my own twin." "It was her," Kendra shrieked, thrashing against him like a trapped animal, though her struggles were futile against his power. "She's the spy. She has the poison." "She has the vial you gave her," Martin roared, silencing her. His gray eyes were gone, replaced entirely by molten silver. "I smelled the lie on you the moment you walked in, Kendra, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that the sister who wiped my brow while I convulsed was the one who poured the wine." Kendra went still. The manic energy seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a cold, hateful clarity. She stopped struggling and looked up at him, her lip curling in a sneer that mirrored his own. "You were always so sentimental," she spat, "just like Seamus." Martin flinched, the pain of that name cutting through his rage. "You used him. You made me believe my best friend betrayed me for ambition." "He didn't want to do it," Kendra hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "He cried, he begged, but he loved me more than he loved you. Men are so easy to break when they are in love, Martin. A few whispers, a few promises of a shared throne. He would have done anything for me." "Why?" Martin asked, his voice cracking. "We were born together, we ruled together." "We did not rule," Kendra screamed, the mask of the elegant princess dissolving into ugly, raw entitlement. "You ruled. I sat in the background and smiled while you took the glory simply because you were born male. I was the firstborn. I was the smarter one. The throne belonged to me by right, and you sat on it like a brute." She laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "I didn't want you dead, brother. I just wanted you broken. I wanted you in that chair, weak and pathetic, so I could finally run this kingdom the way it deserved. And I would have gotten away with it, too, if you hadn't brought that stray dog into the palace." She glared at Esther with pure loathing. Martin closed his eyes for a second, a single tear escaping to track down his scarred cheek. When he opened them again, the silver was gone, leaving only the weary gray of a man who had lost his last family member. "Guards," Martin said, his voice flat. "Take her to the dungeon. She is to be charged with high treason and the murder of Sheamus, the former beta." The guards, shaking off their shock, rushed forward to seize the screaming princess. As they dragged her away, her curses echoing off the stone walls, Martin did not watch her go. He turned slowly, his movements stiff but steady, and looked at Esther. He stood on his own 2 feet, no longer a broken man, but the distance between them felt like an ocean. The silence that followed Princess Kendra's arrest was deafening. The corridor, once filled with the sounds of betrayal and violence, now held only the heavy breathing of the king and the woman he had wronged. Martin took a step toward Esther. For the first time she saw him move as a whole man, powerful, imposing, his stride eating up the distance between them. But instinctively Esther took a step back. Martin froze. The pain in his eyes was sharper than any physical wound. "Esther," he pleaded, his voice rough, "please, it's over, she's gone, you're safe." "Am I?" Esther asked, her voice trembling. She looked at his strong legs, then up to his face. "You trapped her, Martin, just like you tried to trap me. You wore a mask to test my loyalty. You let me believe you were a monster, then a cripple, then a stranger." She shook her head, clutching her satchel to her chest. "I fell in love with the man in the library, but I do not know the man standing before me." "I am the same man," Martin insisted, reaching out a hand. "I did it to survive. I did it because I was terrified of losing you." "And in doing so, you lost me anyway," Esther whispered. "I cannot marry a man who needs to trick me to trust me. I cannot live waiting for the next test." She turned and walked away. She expected him to roar, to command the guards to stop her, to use his alpha authority to force her to stay. But he didn't. He stood silent and still, letting her walk out of the palace gates and into the cold night. That was his first act of true love. Esther did not return to her stepmother's house. She found a small cottage on the edge of the village, earning her keep as a seamstress. The winter was harsh, matched only by the cold ache in her chest. She missed him. God, she missed the rumble of his voice and the warmth of the fire in the library. But she held firm. Self-respect was a new garment she was learning to wear, and she would not trade it cheaply. Then the letters began. They didn't come with royal seals or demands. They arrived via a simple messenger. The first was an apology, raw, unpolished, and devoid of royal haughtiness. He wrote of his therapy, of the nights he spent staring at the empty chair, of the realization that his paranoia had been Kendra's greatest weapon against him. Weeks later, a package arrived. Inside was the leather-bound book of poetry she had left on her bed in the palace. On the flyleaf, in his heavy, jagged handwriting, he had inscribed, "For the woman who taught me that words are stronger than steel." Spring broke the winter frost, and with the first blooms of wildflowers, the king came to her. He didn't bring a retinue of guards. He rode alone, dismounting at her humble gate with a stiffness that reminded her his legs, though healed, still remembered pain. He wore no crown, only a simple tunic and trousers. Esther stepped out onto her porch, her heart hammering a traitorous rhythm. He looked healthier, the shadows under his eyes gone, his shoulders unburdened by the weight of hidden secrets. "I didn't come to order you back," Martin said, stopping at the foot of her stairs. He looked up at her, shielding his eyes from the sun. "I came to tell you that the palace is clean. Kendra's spies are gone. The traps are dismantled." "And the king?" Esther asked softly. "Is he still looking for enemies in the shadows?" "The king is learning," Martin admitted. "He is learning that a fortress with no doors is just a prison." He took a breath, his gray eyes shining with a vulnerability he had never shown as Lord Brennan. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee in the dirt of her garden. It was a struggle, she could see the wince of effort, but he stayed there, looking up at her with absolute reverence. "I don't want a servant, Esther," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't want a submissive who fears me. I want the woman who told a lord to go to hell to defend a cripple's honor. I want the woman who saw the man inside the beast." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a ring, not a gaudy diamond, but a band of silver twisted like two vines growing together. "I cannot promise I will never be afraid," Martin whispered, "but I promise I will never test you again. I will trust you with my life, my throne, and my heart. Will you come home?" Esther looked at the man kneeling in the dirt, the alpha who had learned to yield. The fear that had driven her away melted under the warmth of his sincerity. "Get up, Martin," she said, a smile breaking through her tears like the sun through rain. He stood, uncertainty clouding his face. Esther walked down the steps and closed the distance between them, placing her hands on his chest. She could feel his heart beating, strong and steady. "My feet are tired of walking," she whispered, looking up into his eyes. "Take me home." Martin let out a ragged breath and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. And as he kissed her under the spring sun, Esther knew that the tests were over. They had both survived the winter, and finally the wolves were at rest.